Mr. Speaker, we should be talking about the fiscal deficit today, but I'm disappointed to have to be raising questions about the ethical deficit here. The awarding of a multi-billion-dollar Alberta government legal case to a Calgary law firm with close ties to the Premier raises disturbing questions of conflict of interest, perceived conflict of interest, manipulation of the process, and at the very least, horrible judgment on the part of the then Justice Minister, now Premier. How could the Premier let herself and the province's reputation be so badly damaged?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, our Minister of Justice has spoken very clearly to the process that was followed. The suggestion that the Leader of the Opposition is making is absolutely inaccurate and false. In fact, Mr. Speaker, when the decision was made by the Government of Alberta as to who to retain on this file, I was not the Justice Minister. I was not a member of Cabinet. I was an MLA running to be the leader of this party, and I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, that we are confident that the decisions that have been made to recover billions of dollars from the tobacco industry are in the hands of a firm that was of good service to taxpayers, cost-effective, Mr. Speaker, and selected by other jurisdictions.
Mr. Speaker, since documents that I will table make it clear that it was the Justice Minister's sole decision, and since the conflict of interest legislation states in Section 3 and Section 4 that a member is in breach if he or she uses their office to improperly further another person's private interest, isn't it plain to the Premier that this is exactly what occurred?
Speaker, I hope that the Honourable Leader of the Opposition will also table the document from the previous Justice Minister, the now Agriculture Minister, in June of 2011, when he was the one that signed the final item deciding to go with TRL, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I will table the December 14, 2010 document with the former Justice Minister's signature on it, which shows that she was the sole decision maker in this case. Mr. Speaker, when one of the principals in this firm in question is the Premier's ex-husband, a 20-year political associate, a campaign regular who even led the Premier's transition team when she became Premier, you have to ask why. Didn't she recuse herself as Justice Minister in making this decision?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's been lots of talks and innuendo here, but there is nothing new. Mr. Speaker, this has been public for months, literally for months, Mr. Speaker, and yet when it suits a certain political advantage to bring it up, they bring this up against the Premier today. I think this House deserves better.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me refresh the Premier's memory. The Justice Minister's memo, December 14th, 2010 decision granting the contract to the consortium that includes her ex-husband and longtime political confidence firm cites, and I quote, perceived conflicts of interest, actual conflicts of interest, the structure of the contingency arrangement, and the importance of a Made in Alberta litigation plan, which is why she writes the best choice for Alberta will be the International Tobacco Recovery Lawyers. How could the Premier miss the perceived conflict of interest that were evident when she was making the individual decision to select this firm of her former husband?
That is brutal. Government House Leader, you rose for a point of order at 156. That's been noted, as has the other one that was raised at 148. Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What the Honourable Leader of the Opposition does not disclose was that there was a committee that had appeared before this, and the committee it was an independent review committee, and there was also a tendering process where there were 4 firms that expressed matters of interest. And, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in the earlier exchange, the final decision was made by the previous Attorney General, who is now the Minister of Agriculture, who is in no way anywhere near connected to this alleged conspiracy.
I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that's simply not true.
Exactly.
I will also table the January 13th, 2011.
Sit down.
Sit down, Dave.
January 13th, 2011 status update, which states.
Remember. Telling your own leader to sit down is not an appropriate statement to be making, honourable member. It's an interjection that ought not be tolerated here. And let's cut down on the interjections. And much as people appreciate a little bit of applause, we've been pretty lenient over the years to allow applause at times on both sides of the House. However, there is a time when we can maybe shorten it a bit to move on with the question period. Honourable Leader.
Where it states, no one consortium stood out above the others in the process the Justice Minister just spoke about, but shortly before Christmas, the Premier, selected the International Tobacco Recovery lawyers. Above Alberta-based Bennett Jones, above Alberta-based McLennan Ross. Why is it that it came down to choosing a Florida firm with Alberta connections to a smaller firm tied to the Premier?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is quoting a newspaper article, and I thank her for that. Again, Mr. Speaker, as I've dealt with the particular issues, Mr. Speaker, if you look at all of the other firms that express interest, every one of them talks about being part of a national office. Well, Mr. Speaker, we want a consortium that acts solely for Alberta taxpayers in the event that there's another opportunity to deal with our particular issue, and it is not the same interest as another provinces like BC or Saskatchewan. We need a made-in-Alberta solution, Mr. Speaker, and that is what we got in this process.
Honourable member.
It's obvious that the 4 other provinces involved in tobacco litigation saw no problem having Bennett Jones as their lawyers. No problem at all. Won't the government admit that this decision had nothing to do with the litigation and everything to do with political reasons?
Mr. Speaker, I say once again that I'm fully confident that Albertans are receiving the best possible legal representation pursuant to this open and public tender, and we picked the one of the 4 that best represents our interests. And again, Mr. Speaker, it's on a contingency basis. So if this firm receives no money, guess what? The Alberta taxpayer pays no money.
Honourable member for Airdrie.
The Law Society Code of Conduct states, quote, a lawyer must not act personally in a matter when the lawyer's objectivity is impaired to the extent that the lawyer would be unable to properly and competently carry out the representation, unquote. The explanation provided underneath this rule says this refers to situations in which a lawyer's professional objectivity in a matter may be threatened or destroyed by circumstances personal to the lawyer, such as a family or other close relationship or a financial interest. To the Premier, as the province's lawyer, why didn't you remove yourself from awarding the tobacco lawsuit when such a clear conflict existed?
Mr. Speaker, the Government of Alberta made a decision as to who to retain. I was not the Justice Minister at the time that the government made that decision. And the opposition can stand up every single day and say that I was. But, Mr. Speaker, I wasn't. It is simply not the case. It is not true, and I truly believe that Alberta and the Government of Alberta made an appropriate decision, a cost-effective decision, and hired a firm that is highly capable of undertaking this litigation in the best interests of Albertans. And I congratulate the government for making that decision.
Mr. Speaker, I quote from the memo written by the Premier at the time. Considering the perceived conflicts of interest, actual conflicts of interest, the structure of the contingency arrangement, and the importance of made-in-Alberta litigation plan, the best choice for Alberta will be the International Tobacco Recovery lawyers, signed by you. It's black and white, Madam Premier. Why did you do this? Why did you not recuse yourself?
I'd have to answer.
Honourable member, I will allow this question, but the preamble that just took place ought not occur again, and so let's please abide by that, because I have to strictly enforce it.
There are 4 factors cited in that memo. In that memo, We look to the fact that we do talk about perceived conflict of interest, actual conflict of interest. These are entirely appropriate to be raised by the Department of Justice, Mr. Speaker. On top of that, we had the opportunity at that time to talk about a made-in-Alberta solution, Mr. Speaker, and cost-effective service for taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, at the time, that memo truly reflected what needed to be considered. The Government of Alberta, 4 months later, when I was not the Minister of Justice, I presume considered the same factors, and that's why the decision was made, Mr. Speaker. It would be incorrect to highlight one factor over others, and it's time for this to stop.
To the Premier, I have another problem, so I need to ask, Mr. Speaker. If I need to make a complaint on behalf of Albertans to the Law Society of Alberta for what seems like an egregious violation of professional code of conduct, this is a question. It's a question. How can I feel comfortable doing so? How can I...
Mr. Speaker.
How can I feel comfortable doing so when the President-elect of the Law Society of Alberta itself happens to be Karsten Jensen, senior partner in, you guessed it, the exact law firm that you awarded the tobacco contract to? The tangled web never ends, does it?
Speaker, this is getting absolutely absurd. There is a legal profession in this province made up of a group of people called benchers who absolutely protect their independence, Mr. Speaker. The members of the benchers, the Law Society of Alberta, elect a president. If this person, who theoretically should understand what the Law Society is now prepared to malign the legal profession in this province, Mr. Speaker, then I have no idea where this discussion is supposed to go. But I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, that if this honourable member decides to make a complaint, go ahead.